I've got some OC for you. All true. And what I have written word for word is exactly that. A few years back, when my parents had left the military, my father had trouble looking for work. We eventually moved into a lodge that my grandparents managed in the Northwest in order to make things work. As it turns out, the month we move in, a job opportunity for my father and large house right near my school. Mind you, the drive to my school from the lodge was 45 minutes. And becoming a strain on funds became available. A few months passed, and the only thing we really had complaints about with the home was the windows. At all times in this house was it freezing, and the power bill to crank the heat high enough to keep us warm was ridiculous. So, naturally, we began bundling up with extra blankets at night and staying together in the same room during dinner, with TV, etc. A note from here, at this time, we had 2 dogs. A hunting hound for my father and a Dachshund for me. The hound was nice, but more of a tool, while the Dachshund was the family pet. Every night this little wiener dog would hop up on my lap, do a few circles, then sleep between my ankles using either foot as a headrest. I loved the little guy. One day towards the end of our stay in the home, we noticed some odd things. The most prominent of which was that during dinner, my father mentioned loving how the Dachshund kept his feet warm some nights, that night in particular. I responded that I loved that as well. But he must have been mistaken. I had kept my door closed after my dog came into my room, and my parents did as well. We passed it off as one of us was mistaken. The same night, I left the door open, as the dog had gone up to my parents' bedroom, and I hoped they would open it by going to the bathroom or otherwise, and that he would return to me. Around 2:20-ish that morning I heard the little chatter of dog's nails on the tile in the hallway, followed by the soft patting of feet on the shag carpeting, then felt the small dog hop onto the bed and eventually come to a rest between my feet. I remember smiling, feeling his warmth, then going to sleep. The next morning, I woke for school. Just before my father left for work and noticed my dog was gone. A little confused, I asked my father about it, whom informed me that the dog had joined him that night. We exchanged odd looks, but again, played it off as misremembering. Before I left for school, I saw that the dog had been left out that night in the backyard. With this, I suspected something was horribly wrong. By this I mean, I was tearing with fear as to what was happening. I was certain I had felt the dog, as was my dad. And yet he had stayed outside that night. I told my mother, who, obviously, didn't believe me. Later, I brought it up with my father. I remember him honestly showing some concern over it and offering a proposal. He said, "Look, we'll leave the dog in your room. Lock your door, and we'll see if something happens." That night, I did as he asked and locked my door with the little dog in my room. We promptly fell asleep and awoke the next morning with little issue. When I opened my door, I found my father in the living room talking on the phone to what sounded like our pastor from church. The day following the pastor's visit went uninterrupted, and it seemed that whatever was happening was pacified. No strange feelings, no sounds, no vanishing dogs. Everything seemed normal. At this point, my mother and I noticed that the house was getting colder, but I remember my father calling us wussies and saying if I ever wanted to go hunting with him, I'd need to get a little more used to the cold. A week later, the dog things began happening again. We would hear the nails, then the footsteps, then feel the jump, and finally the dog resting. I became so scared that I started locking my door, which did nothing to stop the happenings. One night when I felt the dog jump into my lap, I flipped on my dresser light only to hear a door slam down the hall. I never did this again. We decided to take a vacation from the home to get some perspective and release some tension. We went to visit family and snowboard for a while. When we got back, we found my little Dachshund mutilated in the backyard. His chest had been covered in puncture wounds and his legs were broken. Mind you, he wasn't dead. We brought him to the vet and they were able to patch him up. But they needed to keep him for a couple weeks. The happenings occurred nightly throughout this time. The day we brought him home, he seemed so happy, excited. We played with him and gave him table scraps. We were just happy he made it through whatever happened. That night we found the dog in the backyard again with the same wounds. Only this time he didn't make it. He had bleed all over the yard and was laying out on a scrap of cardboard as if delivered to us. I shit you not, this was the most horrified and sad I had ever been. From here on, we didn't feel the dog on our lap, hear the chatter in the hall, nor that familiar shag carpet sound. Only silence. Believe it or not, this is where things get really weird. My brother, at this time, 6, began talking to an imaginary friend in his room. He wouldn't talk to us about it, but we could hear him through the door. He would talk about extremely vulgar things, and we could hear my brother saying that the things were bad and that he would go to hell for saying them. I quote this next part, "Brother, so what do you like to do, anyway?" Silence. "Brother, you shouldn't say things like that. My mama says that Jesus doesn't like them." Silence. "Brother, oh." Silence. "Brother, okay, I'll see you later then." At this point, we opened the door and found my brother staring into his open closet. We asked him who he was talking to and about what, but he only responded, "My friend in the closet." He won't let me say anything else. We duct taped the closet shut. I don't know if I mentioned this, but most all of these happenings only happened at night, either right before we went to bed or around 2-ish. We began sleeping in the living room together. My mom and dad on the couches, my brother and I in sleeping bags on the floor nearby. In the center of our room was a small kerosene furnace that kept us warm, as at this time, it had begun to get so cold. We couldn't keep warm with blankets alone. Things began happening separately to the family. My brother would wake up in his room, and we would find him in front of the closet with the duct tape peeled back or missing altogether. I would hear footsteps down the hallway towards the garage and hear an elderly male voice beckoning me. My mother would hear a young man's voice whispering my father's name at her and my father's head of the couch. And my father would see figures in the shadows watching us. I would cry myself to sleep often, and as I type this, my own fear is making my eyes water a bit. We had another pastor come in to bless our home, but once he stepped into the door, he looked at the stairs to the second floor, where my brother's room was, and said that it was evil, that we needed to leave as soon as humanly possible, and then he left. A few nights later, everything stopped. This moment of respite continued for almost a week before I began experiencing it again. I began hearing a soft whisper from down the hallway. I didn't understand the voice, but a voice alone kept me from walking towards that end of the house until daybreak. Basically, our family would hole up in the living room from sunset to daybreak, where everything seemed normal. My parents began to think that the entire ordeal was over and thought it would be best if we all returned to our rooms and forget anything ever happened. I told them about the voice, and the idea immediately fell through. At night, I'd wake up at what I assume was 2-ish, since my clock was in my room, and I refused to go back and get it. It was about 8 feet from the garage door, where I heard the voices, to hear the voices again. They'd say things like, "Come closer," then laugh, mockingly, or, "Please come here. There's something I want to show you," then stifle a giggle. I remember one dream at this time, where I had come face to face with a large horned shadow held out a blackened silhouette of my house to me, and when I touched it, I became so cold, frightened, and tormented that I woke up and literally pissed myself while screaming in pain. My family began looking for a new home. Finally, one afternoon the family was getting prepared for the night. Snacks near the furnace, blankets and pillows ready, and the TV to keep our thoughts occupied. I got up to go to the bathroom. It was only around 4 in the afternoon, so we had at least a few hours of daylight left. As I walked to the bathroom, I heard the voice again, and it made me freeze. "I'm here," it whispered. It was in the same flicking hole I was. I felt literally paralyzed. I heard footsteps from behind me and felt chilled as they passed, leading to the garage. "Come on, you little pussy," it whispered. I couldn't do anything, and for a moment I thought about simply screaming and collapsing, perhaps hoping it would take pity on a little crying boy. The voice laughed again. Suddenly, with a feeling of overwhelming desperation, I ran to the garage and opened the door and leapt into the cold. There. I screamed out loud. All I heard was laughter. The kind of laughter where your sides hurt and you can't catch your breath. I felt horrified, humiliated, and alone. My parents, hearing the scream, ran down the hall and found me crying in the garage. The voice began to turn gruff and elderly from here. I know I'm dragging on, so I'll finish up here soon. I recognized it as an old man, but now it didn't sound menacing. It sounded pleading. My brother said that he heard the voices too, but I didn't care. The begging and crying was starting to drive me insane. All it would say was, please. Help an old man, or I'm so sorry I couldn't handle it. That weekend my grandfather, still running the lodge, fell out of a tree while trimming branches away from the lodge sign and broke most of his ribs and his back. The chainsaw, my grandmother told me, landed just a foot or two away and that it was a miracle he didn't die. Last bit. I was the first to bring up the similarity to our dog from just a few weeks ago and how the situations were the same. We moved into a friend's home that night. Now, we live just a few miles away in our own home. Since that day we haven't had any strange incidents, but I still have nightmares, awful bouts with depression, and dream of killing myself on common occasion. Sometimes I see a man killing my family while I sit on the floor in my sleeping bag, dumbfounded. Next to the couches my parents slept on. Let me tell you this, please don't fuck with shit like this. I would give anything not to have moved in that house. It's messed with my head so much, I can't begin to explain how I feel after another nightmare. Hope you had your fill. I sure have. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe.